If there was ever a time when the word bonus was really appropriate for our bonus content, this would be it. These videos are completely optional, and I'd actually recommend not viewing these videos until you've completed your final project using the techniques and the processors that we've already discussed. All right, with that out of the way, we're going to talk about Acustica Audio's Nebula and then by extension, the Aqua plugins that use the same technology. And because this technology is very different from what we've looked at so far, this theory video is probably more important than most of the theory videos that we've put out thus far. So I was really in kind of two states of mind as to whether or not I wanted to include content on Nebula. I ultimately decided I would do it because it is out there as freeware. It's a great resource. It can really work fantastically well, but you also have to proceed with a little bit of caution. That's why this is going into the bonus section, because it's very easy for Nebula to break your flow or to consume you in some cases and really trying to dial in a setting that sounds right to your ear. There are times when Nebula just doesn't really work. And if you're a beginner, you may be a little more prone to just keep trying and just hope and pray that it's going to fit in. But I think that with Nebula, like with all plugins, you need to take the mindset of, okay, if I can't get the settings in a couple of minutes, if it's not sounding the way that I want it to sound, just leave it out. And I know that that's always easier said than done. But again, Nebula, it's really cool. It's something that doesn't get a lot of attention on the internet. People are really a love it or hate it kind of thing. I'm more in the middle, so I'm going to try to give you that middleman's perspective. I'm also not a professional mix engineer. I'm not a professional mastering engineer. I don't do those things by trade, and I'm not a Nebula Pro user. So I look at Nebula in a certain way, and I don't own the actual, advanced version of it. So I really can then pick and choose when I want to try it. And so I've never really mastered this plugin the way I tend to master any plugins that I buy because it's freeware. So this is kind of an exception to what we've normally talked about, where with this plugin, we can just kind of bring it in. Do we like it? Do we not like it? All right, let's leave it out. But again, there is a lot of theory that we have to cover, and we're going to try to do that as quickly as possible so that we can jump in and work with this processor. And this is one of the few examples where seeing somebody work with it makes a big difference in being able to use it effectively yourself. So the 1%, I'm sure many of you, especially if you're from America, you're familiar with this idea of the 1%. And it's roughly the same idea when we talk about the professional studio world. Not to say that these people are bad people or anything like that. It's really more a matter of circumstance. So this is going to help us understand the whole point and idea behind Nebula. So when we talk about a mix, and we spent some time with this in the last few videos, we talked a lot about cohesion and kind of getting that little bit extra, that thing to kind of push it over the edge, to bring everything together. That's what I would describe as the 1%. And oftentimes that comes from working on the actual hardware. And if you don't have access to the actual hardware, getting that sound may not be possible regardless of how much you know or how good you are at working with your processors. This is why if you always, though, focus on and work to the strengths of the processors and do what you can do, you should have no problems and your mix is still going to be fantastic at the end of the day. Some people are very obsessed with trying to get that sound and it drives them crazy. And so this is where Nebula can actually be very beneficial. It's one of its real strengths is that it can get you the 1%, albeit sometimes at a pretty serious cost. So gear emulations, and when I'm saying gear emulations, I mean software plugins that are like analog modeled. They've gotten pretty good, but they can't do everything. You can't model every single circuit, every single piece of electronics that's built into these things. It just wouldn't be practical. It would take up way too much CPU, and then the plugins that you buy would be really expensive. So I actually think it's a good thing that with the plugins we have, that they don't emulate everything because they wouldn't really be all that usable. So we also need to talk about the new generation if we want to put all of this into perspective. And I think we should put all of this into perspective just to make it fair. Current and future generations are growing up with what we're going to call the in-the-box sound. So if you're not familiar with what that expression means, What it means is that you normally, with a modern production, especially something that's on budget or that has to be done to a deadline, is going to be done by recording whatever parts you have to record as cleanly as possible. So you choose the microphone that you like, and then you run it through the cleanest preamps, and then you run it through a really good analog to digital converter. You get those files into the computer, and now all of the processing you're going to do remains in the computer or in the box, even including things like preamp emulations if you want to try to add that little bit extra bit of color. That being said, people will say this is really missing something. It's really lacking that extra bit of vibe that's hard to put into words, but it's something that you can definitely feel when you listen to records from the past. However, music pleasure is always very subjective. And so if you're a teenager now or you're even younger, you're used to the in the box sound, because that's what you've grown up with and that's what you're going to enjoy. The average new generation listener is not going to crave the analog sound in quite the same way that the past generation does. Everybody has that golden generation. Everybody can say they just don't make music like they used to. When I'm 80 years old, I'm sure I'm going to say that. And I'm probably going to be referring to people like Britney Spears and the Backstreet Boys, right? I mean, we all have those pieces of music that we grew up with, and that really means something to us. And then for some people, for older mix engineers especially, they associate quite a bit of that with the gear of that time. However, sales, and I know that we really shouldn't use sales as the benchmark to describe things, but in this case it works well. The music industry is still going pretty strong when you think about it. And if it wasn't, and if people could say it was because of the move to digital, then everything would still be done in the analog domain. I know it's frustrating for mix engineers. I know it's frustrating for mastering engineers who wish people cared more about the fidelity of their audio, but they just don't. And so if you don't care that much, what does it matter if something goes through those analog processors or it doesn't? For a very small percentage of people, it means quite a bit, but for most of us, it means very little. You know, if I go to a party and music is playing and I'm having a bad time, it doesn't matter how that music was made. You know, I definitely have experiences like that. You know, some of the best times that I've had in my own life have probably been when music was playing through my laptop speakers and you're with people that you like and you're having a good time. Okay, those are the memories that stick with you, not whether or not this has gone through, you know, a Neve console or whatever. So I just want to put that into perspective because I think sometimes we get so obsessive about the sound quality and we forget that a good song is a good song regardless of what it's been processed through. And that's probably more of the creator and the producer speaking in me than the mix engineer or mastering engineer, who I'm sure will strongly disagree. Another point worth making is that eventually all the vintage gear, at least in its, you know, default state, untouched, will eventually die out. These parts break down and they just don't make replacements anymore. So in 50 or 60 years, I'm sure something like a Fairchild compressor will still exist, but it's going to be so old and so run down. It's going to sound nothing like the original unit sounded like, and it's probably going to have replacement parts in it that weren't the original parts. So hardware is always going to exist, but I think anyone with an open mind or ear knows that great music can be made entirely in the box without any problems. Okay, so this slide is designed to put it into perspective for you. I always try to tell people, you know, don't break the bank on getting a really good piece of hardware if you're only going to need to use it one or two times and your music is suffering because of it. This is still about the experience of music, not the gear that's being used. Okay, with that being said, we can actually jump in and talk about Nebula and how this relates. So in my opinion, just from working with Nebula and with thinking about it, Nebula is really the attempt to archive the sound of original hardware units, and probably in the future will be the only way for some of us, or for anybody, to really kind of access and have that original sound. Because again, all that vintage gear, it's going to be gone. The parts are going to break down. You can replace them, but it's just not that sound. It's not the original. And Nebula, with its sampling process, has the ability to really archive the sound almost perfectly. But you do need to remember that different units sound differently based on their location, based on where. All of that can actually play and factor in. So some of the knocks on Nebula from people are, oh, this really doesn't sound like my Fairchild compressor. This doesn't sound like my Pultec EQ. Well, exactly, because every single one is different. So while the process with Nebula and how it actually captures these samples isn't perfect and it can be very CPU intensive, the results can be strikingly realistic, especially to people with golden ears who can hear that extra 1%. Sometimes I hear it, sometimes I don't. I'm just going to tell you guys that straight up. Like I said, every unit can be different, so it makes sense to maybe sample the same unit multiple times. I know that seems crazy, but people do it. Another question people have then is this realism? What you can get with Nebula, is it better than emulation or software modeling? And it always depends on the situation. For example, I like the flexibility of most plugins. I know that I can dial the settings in and get an expected result. Sometimes with hardware and sometimes with Nebula, what you think is going to happen doesn't happen. So it's just a matter of perspective and it just depends on the situation. But one of the things that's missing from the emulations, from the plugins, and this is really why Nebula exists, are you can't model everything. You can't get those finer details. You can't model every single piece of electronics that's running through one of these pieces of hardware gear. It just isn't practical. And that's really where Nebula comes in. So we have here Nebula, the sound. Nebula uses a complex form of sampling to get the sound of the hardware, which includes the dynamic layers. So this is different from dynamic processing. When I say dynamic layers, what I mean is if you feed a signal in quietly to a piece of hardware, the way it reacts to it and the way it colors that is probably, or I should say, is different to what happens if you push more gain through it. So Nebula has the ability to react to that. It can get you that effect if that's what you're looking for. Whereas typical software modeling, it's not going to really spend that much time trying to perfect that. And again, honestly, for most listeners, the average person listening to a song, they're not going to know the difference, but you as the mix engineer or mastering engineer might, and therefore getting this realism is of added benefit. So you're getting the actual sound of the hardware unit, and that's something that just can't be said about the majority of processors. So what are a few of the problems that arise with this method? Because, you never get something for free, so there have to be some kind of draw-offs to this. And there are just a few that I could think of off the top of my head. It's sample-based, so there is a quality question. So how was this unit sampled? Was it sampled with really good A to D converters? That's a question. At what frequency? At what sample rate? 96K, 48K, 441K. How does that impact the sound? All of these things do factor in, albeit in very subtle ways. To play back these samples, which is what you're doing with Nebula, requires a lot of latency. Okay, and latency in this plugin can affect quality. So that's something that's a little bit different. The size of the program can be very large for something that maybe is as small as a preamp. So if something is sampled really meticulously, you could have a 50 megabit program just for a preamp. And I say just for a preamp, but it seems like that's a lot of space to take up for one very small effect in the chain that a lot of people aren't even going to hear the difference of. However, let's think about production for a second. And I know I like to get the multi-sampled instruments that have been very meticulously multi-sampled, sometimes hundreds of gigabytes worth for one piano like we looked at before. So that sort of thing is going on the other side too. So it's the same idea. It's the same concept. How meticulously are you going to sample this piece of hardware to try to go for that realism? Certain effects like compression don't always work well. And that's just the nature of the beast here. It struggles a lot with transients. We'll look at that a little bit. And you also can't really, as far as I know, at least with Nebula, you can't model the different ratios that you would have on a compressor. So when you go in there and you're changing the ratio control, what you're really doing is changing the sharpness of the knee. And so really threshold and ratio is kind of just like changing the threshold and then how steep the compression is going to be with the knee. So that's something to be aware of. I don't use Nebula for compression, but we'll look at an example of it so that you can hear an explanation of what I'm talking about. And then also, since we're looking at this like actual hardware, there are some gain staging questions that we have to ask. At what level did the developer intend for you to work at in the DAW? What did they sample this at? What reference are they giving you? Because in the DAW, we have decibels full scale, and with these pieces of hardware, they're almost all to VU, volume units, decibels, VU meters, and all this changes a little bit. So there is a standard that's used. We'll talk about it, minus 18 dBFS, but it's not required, and it's not something that every single developer is going to take into account. So you have to check the documentation. If it's not in the documentation, you really have to use your ear and try to lock in the setting and hope that at some point you get lucky. That's really what it comes down to. And I think that that's a drawback here because there's just a lack of consistency, which is something that we've had with all of our other plugins up till now. Very consistent across the board about where we're getting the effect and locking in the sound that we want. So Nebula, the 1%. Advanced users can do amazing things with Nebula, including dynamics processing. I am not an advanced user. I really can't do those things that I've heard people do. And really, I've heard some people's mixes going through just Nebula, and it's really blown my mind. So non-advanced users like myself tend to stick to a few different processors that work without a lot of fine-tuning or hassle, or that you can easily A/B and know that that's the result or effect that you're going for. Specifically, I tend to stick with the preamps and the EQ. Preamps and EQ lend themselves particularly well to the technology, to that sampling technology. And with the Nebula program, you get all the subtleties that the normal emulations, the normal plugins tend to lack. So the last point I want to make here is to remember that this is more about color, not necessarily control. So you're looking for all those nuances, all of those subtleties, but if you still want compression to be applied, and compression in the way that we've talked about it, you're going to want to use like a very clean compressor after the fact. So you're getting the color of the processor, but then the compression of a digital effect, because it then, hopefully they add up really well. Very confusing to think about and wrap your head around, but once we go in and look at some examples, I think this will make more sense. But what Nebula is really good at is at getting you that extra 1%, getting you that color, getting you that vibe that the emulations just almost always fail to deliver on, especially for those of you with particularly discerning ears. So Aqua plugins, okay? These are going to be a lot easier for us to use, very straightforward, much like what we've seen before. These use the same Nebula-style sampling technology, but they get wrapped in a standalone plugin with a pretty nice and simple user interface. Like we can see here, this is a 3-band EQ, where we have a low band at 80 Hertz, a mid band at 1.8K, and a high band at 8K. Okay, very easy for us to go in here and make adjustments. And really, this particular EQ sounds really, really good, at least in my opinion. So these plugins more so follow the logic of the plugins we've been working with throughout the course, but they are still using that sample-based technology. And that's why the file size on these things is so much bigger than what you'd probably expect, because under the hood, there's still a lot of samples that are having to be played back. A lot of latency still gets brought in. Okay, so that is the theory with Nebula. We're going to jump into the DAW and go through several examples and talk about how to think about working with something that's really basically hardware in the digital domain. So stick around for that. It's going to be quite exciting and also probably quite frustrating. So hopefully you get something new.